They offered him billions to forget her, but he chose the well instead. The water in the bowl was the color of rust. A shallow tin basin, cracked along the rim, sat beneath the leaking edge of a thatched roof. A woman knelt beside it, cupping the brown water gently and pouring it into the open mouth of a child, no older than 2. The child didn't resist. He drank as if it were milk, lips trembling, belly bloated not from food, but from emptiness. She did not cry. She had passed the stage of tears weeks ago. Her name was Mariatou, and she lived in a sun-blasted village on the edge of Burkina Faso's forgotten zones, where drought killed more than war, and silence did worse than guns. Aid had once come, through here years ago, but only for cameras. Now even the dust was too tired to rise. It was this image that found its way to President IBRAHIM Traoré. Not through an advisor, not through the press, but through an anonymous photo tucked inside. A schoolchild's notebook delivered to his convoy during a rural visit. A photo of Mariatou and her son under a crumbling shack drinking rainwater, the child's eyes wide and hollow. The caption scribbled in blue pencil beneath it read, "My aunt feeds her baby with rain because we have no well." Traore read it 3 times, then closed the file, then stood up. No speeches, no press release. He quietly rerouted his entire security operation to the north, where no presidential motorcade had dared to go in over a decade. That evening, Mariatou sat beside a fire with no flames, boiling leaves that had no nutrients. Her child coughed beside her. The sky for once was generous. It began to rain. And so she positioned the tin bowl again, whispering to herself, not in words, but in rhythm. A survival chant, passed down through generations that had always begged the skies to do what governments would not. She didn't hear the cars at first. No one in her village did. But the wind shifted. Suddenly headlights carved through the darkness. Uniformed figures moved in silence, not foreign, not unfamiliar, but alert. Then came the boots, the radios. And at the center of them all, a man with eyes that had seen too many funerals and still refused to close. Traore walked through the mud toward Mariatou without hesitation. His boots splashed in the same puddle her son had been drinking from. He saw her hands cracked from sun. He saw the child's ribs. He saw the bowl, and without speaking, he did what no one expected. He knelt, not out of pity, not for politics, but because, in that moment, he saw his mother, not in name, not in body, but in soul. Before the sun rose again over Mariatou's village, the story had already traveled, not through social media, not through newspapers, but through whispers, soft, reverent, and trembling. They said the president had come, not in a helicopter, not surrounded by flags, but on foot, that he had touched the ground, that he had taken the hand of a woman no one had visited since the last election flyer blew in with the wind. Traore stayed the night, not in a hotel or state facility, but inside Mariatou's compound, a single-room hut with walls made of clay and resilience. His guards wanted to set up tents, but he waved them off. He sat on the floor beside her, listening to the way the night spoke through coughs and creaks and the stillness of a child who had forgotten how to cry. That morning, he called no press conference. Instead, he picked up a stick and drew a circle in the dirt just outside her hut. Around it, he drew lines, paths. People watched, unsure, but those who had seen war recognized the look in his eyes. This was a plan. By afternoon, trucks began to arrive. Engineers, medical staff, surveyors, not dressed in foreign colors, not tied to foreign grants. These were Burkinabe volunteers, quietly assembled over months through a confidential national initiative codenamed the Deep Soil Project. It was a secret plan Traore had kept hidden even from his closest ministers, an emergency response force designed not for cities or headlines, but for the unspoken parts of the country that had never been mapped. Mariatou's village was the first. They started with the well, not a donation, not a plaque, just water. The diggers worked day and night, bypassing bureaucracies that would have delayed it for months. Traore sat beside them at dusk, wiping sweat from his forehead, his military shirt now brown with dust. Mariatu's child, weak but watching, reached out his tiny hand toward the pile of fresh earth. One of the workers picked him up and placed him on their shoulders. And for the first time in years, a child in that village was seen from above, not below. When the water burst through on the fourth day, clean, cold, and alive, the village didn't erupt in celebration. They knelt. All of them, because what had happened was more than infrastructure. It was remembrance. But news travels with enemies too. Photos of Traore kneeling in the village began to leak, first on local blogs, then on international networks. They were all framed carefully. President abandons capital to play savior. Populism in the mud. Symbolism without policy. Western donors questioned the act. Health agencies quietly threatened to pull their data-sharing support. One European ambassador remarked in a private call, "He's making us look unnecessary." Back in the capital, opposition figures seized the moment. They accused Traore of abandoning urban hospitals, of performing charity where policy should rule. Others hinted at political madness. But Traore said nothing. He let the water speak, and then came the retaliation. 4 days after the well was completed, a truck carrying medicine to the village was attacked. Not by insurgents, but by masked men with military-grade equipment. Supplies were burned. 2 drivers were beaten. A message was left behind on a crumpled pamphlet from a foreign aid group. Traore read the report alone in his tent. Then he stood up and made a decision that would shake the continent. The attack wasn't just on medicine, it was a warning. One that presidents before had always heeded. But Traore wasn't made in embassies. He was made in deserts, forged in barracks, tempered by the smell of dried blood and the memory of empty school desks. So when the report of the destroyed supply truck reached him, he didn't call a meeting. He called a burial. At sunrise, he gathered the villagers, mothers, elders, children, and stood beside the ashes of what should have saved them. A burnt box of vaccines, a crushed oxygen tank, scattered syringes blackened by fire. Without a speech, he knelt again. This time not before a child, but before the promise someone had tried to kill. He dug a shallow trench with his hands and buried the charred remains of the aid shipment himself. The people followed, placing stones, dried leaves, and flowers over the ashes. It became a small, quiet grave. Above it, a stick was planted with a torn piece of cardboard. On it, a child wrote, "They burned the medicine, but not the man." That image, raw, wordless, and true, spread like dry season fire, not through press, but through people. What followed was unprecedented. Traore declared the first-ever People's Route project, a self-funded road network from rural villages to urban hospitals, built not by contractors, but by civilians paid through a redirected military logistics fund. It was a shock to the political elite. He had taken money from war and given it to roads. Within weeks, villagers were digging alongside engineers. Sons who had once picked up rifles now carried bricks. Mothers who once carried jerry cans now painted mile markers. Communities competed not for votes, but for whose road reached the next clinic first. Traore moved without fanfare. No public holidays, no first stones, just results. Foreign media didn't know how to frame it. They called it rural mobilization or authoritarian infrastructure. But they couldn't deny what was happening. For the first time in decades, the poorest parts of Burkina Faso were not waiting for aid. They were connecting themselves. But change doesn't come without a counterforce. In Brussels and Washington, intelligence briefings grew darker. Traore's methods undermine international development frameworks. He's threatening regional investment structures. Local empowerment at this scale is uncontrollable. One memo, marked confidential, read, "If we cannot control his system, we must isolate it." Soon after, A series of coordinated cyber attacks hit Burkina Faso's internal databases. Clinic records vanished. Government websites flickered and went offline. Mobile health alerts failed to send. And worst of all, an entire shipment of pediatric vaccines destined for 6 northern villages was mysteriously rerouted and expired. International logistics firms denied responsibility. Investigation stalled. But the people knew. This was not chaos. This was punishment. Traore did not retaliate with threats. Instead, he released a letter, handwritten, scanned, and shared across the country. Not just to citizens, but addressed to every mother. It read, "I cannot stop those who burn, but I will hold your hand until the fire passes. If they block the trucks, we will walk. If they block the roads, we will carry each other. This nation will not be built on noise. It will be built on breath." That letter was read aloud in schools, clinics, even mosques. And somewhere under a thatched roof, Mariatu wept. Not because her child was dying, but because for the first time, her survival had become a national defense strategy. The world was watching now, not with cameras, but with caution. What began as a forgotten village and a rusted water bowl had become a movement too stubborn to die. The powers that once issued loans and drafted reforms in polished halls now found themselves chasing narratives, because Burkina Faso, a name once spoken only in relation to aid, had birthed a model they couldn't patent. Traore had not announced a new Africa. He had simply refused the old one. But the pressure kept rising. Sanctions were whispered. International. Courts eyed his procurement channels. Anonymous sources began leaking stories. Traore hiding funds. Military loyalty slipping. Villages left incomplete. Some true, some twisted, all strategic. But while the world measured his administration by spreadsheets, the people measured it by feet. Because the roads were real. Because the children were living. Because Mariatu's baby now laughed. On the first anniversary of the Rainwater incident, Traore returned to the village, not as a leader, but as a guest. He arrived with no security convoy. Just one small car, dusty from the road. Mariatu greeted him at the same spot she had once fed her son rust-colored water. Only this time she stood tall. Her son, Sumaila, now walked beside her, wobbling with toddler confidence, his stomach full, his eyes bright. In the background, the well still flowed. The school still rang with children's voices. The health post still smelled of soap and chalk. Traore held out his hand. Mariatu took it, without trembling, without fear. But before she could speak, hundreds of women emerged from the village paths, all wearing white, all holding small bowls. Some held them high. Others placed them at Traore's feet, and each bowl was filled, not with water, but with soil. Soil, from the same earth that raised their children, soil from their farms, their homes, their footsteps. One woman stepped forward and said the words that would be carved on a monument a year later. "You saw our hunger and planted something deeper than food." Later that month, the African Union passed a silent resolution, recognizing the Burkina model as a reference for rural transformation. No press release, no grand speech. But in quiet rooms, policies began to shift. In Kenya, mothers requested community-built wells. In Senegal, midwives petitioned for local clinics. In Mali, a new presidential candidate ran on a promise to walk. Like Traore, the ripples reached places no satellite ever could, but it didn't end there. Traore launched the Dignity Fund, a sovereign national reserve financed not by loans, but by voluntary contributions from diaspora communities, entrepreneurs and even farmers who gave with coins and millet. The goal? To protect one promise, that no mother would ever again have to feed her child with rainwater. In a quiet moment one night, far from the lights and titles, Traore sat by a fire outside his own childhood home. No speeches, just silence. He held a letter written by a schoolgirl from the capital. It read, Thank you for holding her hand, because when you held hers it felt like you were holding mine too." He folded the letter, placed it in his pocket, and stared into the flames. Because empires are built with stone. But nations are built with memory. And this one remembered the day a president knelt in the mud, not to lead, but to belong. They didn't need to assassinate him to kill what he stood for. They only had to wait until the people forgot. That was the strategy now, erasure by exhaustion. Months after the monument in Mariatu's village was unveiled, whispers returned. Not from foreign tongues this time, but from within. Whispers that Traore was too distracted with symbolism, that the roads were slowing, that the wells weren't reaching everywhere, that maybe, just maybe, he had done enough, and it was time to return to traditional governance. These weren't complaints, they were poisons, laid carefully in editorials, think tank briefings, and university forums. African populism is unsustainable, they said. He means well but lacks structure. And worst of all, his kindness is costing us credibility with international investors. In the dark, Western advisors who had once gritted their teeth now smiled. He had built the bridge to the people. Now they would burn it, from both sides. But Traore had never relied on the fire of approval. Instead, he began building the final piece of his invisible legacy, the children's courts. In the heart of 6 villages, legal clinics were opened, not for the rich, not for state defense, but for children, places where youth could speak their pain, document abuse, and be heard. Teachers served as translators, elders as witnesses. The children came barefoot. Scared, but they came. And their stories weren't just legal records, they were indictments of decades. Children told how their mothers were beaten for stealing bread, how teachers punished them for bringing hunger into the classroom, how girls were married off for water. These testimonies weren't shouted in parliaments, they were carved into the floorboards of the clinics themselves, a permanent record beneath the feet of future visitors. But just as the courts opened, an old enemy returned, not as a soldier, not as a rival, but as a savior. A well-dressed Burkinabe technocrat, educated abroad, appeared in the press with a golden smile and Western backing. He praised Traore's vision. He offered modernization, partnerships. He promised digital expansion and global alignment. He had no scars on his hands, no dust on his shoes, and yet, some within the capital listened. Some ministers leaned. Some allies began holding longer silences in cabinet rooms. They weren't betraying him. They were simply forgetting who they were before he arrived. One evening, Mariatu visited the new clinic in her district. She didn't speak. She just stood before the etched testimony of a girl named Nene, age 9, whose words read, "I thought the rain was food until I saw her cry." Mariatu ran her fingers across the words, and something stirred in her. That night she began writing. Letters, stories, names. She traveled from village to village, gathering mothers' testimonies, not to protest, but to remind. The next month, she arrived at the National Parliament steps with 3,000 names. No microphone, just a basket. She placed it at the entrance and walked away. Inside the palace, Traore stood alone in his private chamber. A letter lay before him, from an international lender offering $2.4 billion in infrastructure grants, with oversight conditions, enough to pave every road, build every clinic, silence every critic. All it would take was his name. He folded it in half, then again, until it fit inside a small glass of rainwater he had kept beside his window since the day he first met Mariatu, and then he poured it down the drain. Days later, a foreign media outlet ran the headline, "Traore rejects aid that could save thousands. Is this leadership or stubbornness?" The comments were brutal. Hashtags mocked him. A few Burkinabe voices joined in, seduced by platforms and platforms alone. But outside the noise, something happened. One last village well, in the highest, driest region of the country, hit water. The Traore Engineers, underpaid and sleep-deprived, shouted so loud the birds fled the trees. The women fell to their knees. Children dove into the mud, and in that moment a call came through to the capital. "Mr. President, they made it." Traore didn't answer immediately. He simply reached into his drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and handed it to his security chief. "Deliver this," he said. Inside was a short message. "I will not live forever, but let the water speak for me when I am gone." At the village where it all began, a stone now stands beside the original. Bolmaria too once used to catch rain, carved in it not his face, not his title, but only these words. She fed her child with rain. We fed the nation with memory. Traore never claimed to save Africa, but when he took her hand, he reminded us all that no empire survives if its mothers are starving, and that, in the end, is what shook the world.